Hello and welcome to the LinkedIn edition of my interview with Anushri Das Gupta. She's an HR sourcer at Rivian, which is a EV manufacturing company based out of the US. So thank you for joining us, Anushri, and tell us a little bit about what you do as an HR human resources sourcer and sorcerer or sourcer, and then figure out how you match people to the right job descriptions that the company rolls out.
Yeah, so recruitment, of course, is a really huge field, and I can't profess to know everything, and pretty much no recruiter can. So we definitely specialize in our fields. In my case, I went into technical recruitment, which means I pretty much solely work on jobs that require people to do some sort of technical role. And within technical, I specialize in engineering, which means that I'm not really hiring for medical professionals, for example. And again, that's very niche. And it means that I have to basically understand what the technical requirements are, understand what the skill sets are, what are the functions of the role, what kind of skills that they would require for the job, whether they require management skills or not, for example, and accordingly, basically start finding people from various sources. One of the really interesting things is, of course, anytime there are changes in the world or economic shifts, you can expect that the field is going to shift accordingly as well. So it's definitely a very, very dynamic field, and keeping up to date with that, and then still finding people to fill up the positions can be pretty challenging. But at least for me, it's a fun role.
Right. So what is a typical day-to-day task list that you have as a human resource sourcer? How would you describe a day in the life of Anushri Das Gupta at work?
So it depends on where I am in the process with any given job that I'm trying to fill. So I might probably explain it better if I actually describe the process through. So first step is basically having a chat with the hiring manager, understanding what the requisition is. Why do they need to fill that requisition? What will the candidate be doing? What does an ideal candidate look like? What are the qualifications? What's a typical career trajectory for such a person? What are the locations, of course? Then going from there, I actually start, we call it pipelining of candidates, basically trying to find who would be the right candidates for the role, setting up initial conversations with them. So definitely very, conversation heavy, part of the job comes through, and then start sending candidates over to the hiring manager and go forward with the interview processes. Typically for, obviously guiding candidates through the interview processes, preparing them for what the interviews are going to look like, because you don't want to throw anyone into the lion's den. And then, of course, start once they make it through, the last steps, hopefully with an offer, then guiding through what an offer would look like, and then working with other stakeholders to get them through the process and into the organization. So yeah, it's very stage oriented, I would say.
Fantastic. And you mentioned that there are issues that can come up. There could be global crises. So the job descriptions that sort of then pop up could be supply chain management, or sort of experts who maybe got a regional experience. Can you narrate some experiences either from your previous job or this that really was a huge learning curve as part of your HR sort of sourcing role?
Yeah, one of the things that I didn't necessarily expect, but turned out to be obviously a sensitive issue, and might still be a sensitive issue right now, is, of course, anytime there are major global events happening. For example, in 2014, after the Crimea situation, obviously, there were some major legal changes that were taking place. in the United States, there were recruiting sanctions that are placed alongside economic sanctions. They're actually the same, which means that we cannot recruit, for example, people from Crimea. And those are things to keep in mind, when you're doing any kind of international recruiting at that point, that we are obviously subject to those, kind of tricky situations as well. So if you, for example, have a candidate currently in process, may have reached the final stages, you actually have to tell them you cannot proceed. And that's a very, very tough call to make. We had similar situations with candidates from Syria, for example, again, with the sanctions getting placed. So, those are all always things to keep in mind, that there may be times that you have very, very sensitive discussions with candidates. There are sensitive discussions to be had with, hiring managers about, what we can do and what we cannot do. I think so. That's definitely a major thing. In general, immigration is always like a tricky thing. Immigration law. I would say a lot of the legal processes were probably some of the most complicated things to deal with.
Great. I think this gives me sort of an idea to ask the next question. Very often international students are students looking at careers and working perhaps for maybe a few years in the country that they go, especially in the US. There's this H-1B system. If you want to highlight something like, what is like a roadmap for an H-1B? What are the things to look out for? It'll be great to hear from you.
Yeah, so typically, so that you obviously have people who graduate with STEM versus non-STEM degrees. So I mostly deal with candidates who are graduating with STEM degrees, which means that they graduate, when they have OPT, the OPT work permit, which they get after they graduate, and they do have to apply for that separately. That lets them work for about 3 years. But after that, they have to have an H-1B. So the way to get that is that while they're on their OPT, ideally, an employer has to file an H-1B for them. Typically, the filing will take place sometime end March because the deadline is April 1st. The earlier, the better to get the filing and the paperwork done, just because the rush is huge. And the other thing to really keep in mind, it's a lottery system. There is no guarantee of getting the paperwork processed, particularly during COVID. Processing times were huge. So most students would get to hear in May. People were getting to hear in June or July. If you do get approved, your H-1B starts beginning of October, which means that, for example, if you're getting out of the system prior to October, even though your employer has filed for H-1B, it's possible you may have to go back to your home country. So those are things to keep in mind, that there might be a few months of lost period as well if the H-1B has not been filed, say, in your second year, but rather in your third year of OPT. So obviously, the earlier the better. If you can find an employer who's willing to file it in your first or second year itself, that's always better for students. For non-STEM, I don't deal too much with it, but they don't have as much of a chance in terms of the filing. It's they only get one chance, so it's 1 year. To be very honest, and that's true for most employers, they tend to file the H-1Bs only for the STEM candidates rather than the non-STEM candidates, just because there's a higher demand. When they do file for non-STEM, it tends to be for more senior exec level candidates. So for anyone coming to the United States, that's definitely something to keep in mind. That said, I have placed candidates in Canada, which has a very, very different system. Canada does something called a point system. So there are students who have studied in the United States. We haven't been able to place them in the United States. But if you're working for a company that may have an office in Canada, you could potentially check with management and see if they can potentially place you in an office there.
Great. I think this was really important to know, because very often students don't plan or plan well in advance, or don't know that there are options, they could discuss with their employer who's interested in them to even look at other countries where they could work. So very useful knowing the work that you do in human resource sourcing, and wish you all the best in the future. Take care then. Bye.
Bye.